Friends, as we get ready to jump into our message, I want to ask that you would take a few moments to register your attendance. You can see on the screen a way to text a number and to let us know that you're worshiping with us here at Common Grace Online. And you can see what to text there. If this is the first time that you've ever registered your attendance, you'll get a text back real quick with a link. Click on that link. You can give us a little more information that will help put your name with that. If you've done this before, then you'll simply get a response that says, "Thank you for registering your attendance." This is all so that we can help keep tabs and keep connection with you so that we can continue to build as a community. So I want to ask you to do that this week and each time that you worship with us. And it doesn't matter if it's Sunday morning or you're watching this Tuesday night or whatever the case is, just take a quick moment to do that. I would be so incredibly grateful. This morning, we are wrapping up our series that we've been doing these last few weeks called Found, in which we have looked at the life of Moses, one of the great patriarchs of the faith, one whose story is told in incredible detail, and seen what his life might have to instruct us in our lives and in the midst of our transition. We're also, of course, wrapping up what we have called this year of the story, and what an incredible journey that has been. I'm so grateful to Matt and Chandler and to folks who have worked behind the scenes to help make this possible and do some of the advertising and all of that. And I just want to say that as we're wrapping that up, this has been a great journey, and I'm so grateful for it. Today, we jump all the way to the end of Deuteronomy, to the end of Moses' story. I want to invite you to hear these words. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. The Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, from Naphtali to the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, and the whole region of the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zor. Then the Lord said to Moses, "This is the land that I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said, I will give your descendants a land. I will let you see it with your eyes, Moses, but you will not cross into it." And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there on Moab, as the Lord had said. They buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite of Beth-Peor, but nobody to this day knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over, and then jumping down. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all the signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all the officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. May God add blessing to our reading and understanding of these words. I want you to think for just a moment to get the image in your mind of what came to your mind the first time that you heard of Common Grace. And maybe that was the phrase Common Grace. Maybe it had a name, but maybe you came to Common Grace when it was just being announced that Grace was going to do a new thing, an extension campus in South Olathe. Maybe it didn't have a name yet when you were first introduced to this concept, to this idea. Maybe it didn't even have a location. It was just South Olathe. If that's the case, what was the first picture that came into your mind of what this new thing would be? Maybe you came around a bit later, when we had our swaggerific logo, when we had a cool name that of course had to have grace in it somewhere because everything around here does. And you heard that we were meeting in a conference center. Was that unexpected to you? Maybe you saw the bright green t-shirts and you thought, this is the church that I've been waiting for all my life. Or maybe you knew all of that, but then you found out that we didn't have a worship leader scheduled for the first week we were to kick off, and you began to scratch your head and wonder what it was that you were getting into. If that was the case, what did you imagine? What came to your mind? Maybe you came a bit later. You learned about a church that was meeting in the Ball Conference Center. You saw one of those crazy people who would jump out of their car on 151st or on K7 to set up signs to direct people to the church, and you thought, these are my people. Maybe that's when you came around. But when you knew you were going there, what did you expect to find? Maybe it was still later. Maybe you came to an event that we did a fall festival or an Easter egg hunt. Maybe you were one of the folks who's come to be a part of our community through our Living Nativity that has had so many iterations over the years. Maybe that was how you were introduced, or you found us by somebody referring you to our place. And what was it that you were imagining? What was it that you were envisioning? What did you think you would find when you went there? Maybe you've come to Common Grace more recently. And maybe you've never gathered in person. Maybe it's all been online. Maybe you were introduced to us online through an ad or a service or a sermon that somebody shared or somebody referred you to. Maybe your first experience of the front door was well, here online. And if that was the case, what did you think it would look like when you got more involved? Maybe you drove by Ridgeview and you saw a white steeple on a hill and you thought, I should check it out. Maybe you did extensive research online. Maybe you aren't really sure how you got here, but whenever your earliest recollection of thinking about coming to this place, whether it was named or not, I want you to imagine what it was that you were seeing in your head, what it was that you thought you were walking into. Whatever it is, I want you to hold on to that, to what you thought that would be, what you expected. And then I want you to think about your first time walking through the door, whether that was for worship or an event or an activity. What was that like? Was it awkward? Did you experience good energy? Did you imagine that we'd have pyrotechnics? I'm sorry if you did. What did you think that people would wear? Did you feel like you fit in? Were you afraid that you wouldn't fit in? Did people talk to you too much or not enough? What was that first experience walking through the door like? One more thing that I want you to think about. I want you to hold that vision of what you expected that first time before you really got into it. I also want you to think that whenever you felt like you were acclimated, like you were just a little bit comfortable with this Common Grace community, worshiping in person or online, doing events, activities, having conversations with folks, being a part of small groups, whatever that looked like for you, when you were a little bit integrated into the community, where did you imagine we would be in the year 2023? What did you think things would look like? Where did you think we would be? How did you think things would be shaped? Have you ever wondered what Moses imagined? I mean, let's go all the way back to what we talked about. There was the burning bush, and he gets called, and there was the him finding himself. But when God shows up, and Moses turns to the burning bush, and I imagine God says, thank goodness somebody is finally listening. And God says, I'm calling you. What do you think Moses thought was going to happen? What do you think Moses imagined? I mean, it seems like he knew there was going to be some level of conflict, or at least he was really comfortable, because he at first says, no, thank you. Please no. How about not? God, could you please find somebody else? What do you think Moses was imagining in that moment? Maybe it was as simple as he was settled and things were fine. He'd moved from Egypt into this strange land, and then he'd had a family and he established himself, and it was maybe a little bit easier when he didn't have to wrestle with his mixed identity. But maybe he knew that it was going to be hard, that any leadership challenges, hard leadership journeys, like journeys of faith, are often full of surprises. What do you think Moses imagined? When God said that you are going to set my people free, you're going to lead them out of captivity, did he think that there was going to be a massive angelic army that was bigger and stronger than the Egyptian army that was going to come in and wipe them out? Did he think that he was going to walk right up to Pharaoh and say, guess what? God said, you need to let my people go. And Pharaoh was going to be like, I don't want to mess with your God. Go ahead. Did he think that all of the people were going to be excited to receive him or anxious? Did he think that the people of Israel were going to believe him or not? Did he think that they were going to revolt? Do you think he had some idea of how long they would be wandering in the wilderness? Or was it just supposed to be a short walk? Did Moses imagine himself standing on the other side of the river, not the first river, the second river, high-fiving everybody as they come into the promised land? Good game, we made it. What do you think Moses had in mind? His journey would include moments of celebrating great faithfulness, God's manna and mercy. His journey would include mountaintop moments and experiencing God. The scriptures will say, as we read today, like nobody else did. His moments will also include all kinds of other Midians as he's come out of Midian, the Midian of wandering in the desert, the Midian of people's faithlessness and forgetting who God is, of apostasy and idolatry. the conflict that exists between Pharaoh and him, the conflict that exists when the people become hungry and don't know where they're going to get their food and their water from. They will literally cover all kinds of physical terrain, up mountains and down them, up another mountain and down it, through the desert, through oasis, through occupied lands and around them. All of that will be a part of Moses' journey, and all of that is what brings him to Deuteronomy 34. We have skipped whole books forward in the scriptures from where we were last week to come to this point, the end of Moses' life. If you want to read the latter part of Deuteronomy, what you'll hear is these different prayers and celebrations, these different times in which they're attributed to Moses as there's a writing about Israel, remember who you are and remember who your God is and stay faithful and true. These are like parting words and speeches that he's giving to the people that are being left behind. As a leader is lifting up what is most important. And then we come to Deuteronomy 34, in which we read the end of his story and the death. Go back to that vision that you had of common grace, the first one and the second one, and where you thought we would be at this time. And maybe those are one and the same because you haven't been around that long, and that's okay. So in what ways does common grace today differ from what you expected? Maybe you never expected a pandemic. Turns out most of us didn't. And the ways that has changed things. When I think about what the biggest difference is for me, as I consider what I imagined it to be as this vision was taking shape, the biggest difference for me is all about physical location. The fact that we have a digital location that we gather. I never in my life imagined that I would be recording sermons every single week. That was not in my consciousness. For common grace, let alone for my entire career as a pastor. I never imagined that. I said last week I thought we would be in a school and we ended up in a conference center. And then I thought we would be in a conference center for a long time. Thought I'd get to see students turn around that door. And I made a commitment that if we ever did move to another place, that it had to have a revolving door. There's not one at the Ridgeview campus, but I'm just saying there's space to put one in. You could. I'm leaving. That's up to you all. But I imagined it would be in the south part of Olathe, the Spring Hill, the Gardner area, somewhere down there, southern Johnson County. I mean, my wife and I bought our house down there because that's where we thought things were going to be. But a pandemic made us rethink about what our front door was. Not literally the revolving, but how it is that people come to a church. And realizing that more energy needed to be invested here than our physical location, seeing people come from different places. When I think about the biggest difference, it's about our physical location and our physical building. I think about the joy of not being mobile and having a place that we can sort of make our own. Think about having a studio space where we can do this. That's the biggest difference for me, the routine and all that's surrounded that. What's the biggest difference for you? What did you imagine things might look like? And how does it differ from where they are now? I imagine that Moses thought things would be different than they ended up being. I think he envisioned something other than seeing the promised land from the mountain, looking out but not being able to walk into it. That's what the scripture says happened, is that God calls him up to this mountain. And God said, I want you to see all of this land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Generation after generation after generation of your people have been longing for this. But you're not going to go into it. But that's what Moses gets. I don't think that's what he envisioned, but that's what he gets. And I have to be honest, I've always thought that this ending to Moses' story was really cruel, if I'm honest with you. That it seems really mean. And I'll just read the words of Ruth Haley Barton, who says this succinctly and I think summarizes my thoughts pretty well. She says Moses' ultimate letting go into the presence of God took place on the highest peak of Mount Nebo, where God guided Moses to go and survey the promised land one last time. He was 120 years old, but his vigor was unimpaired. The scriptures say he was still able to climb mountains. Since my Sunday school days, I've known the end of Moses' story. He got to see the promised land, but he didn't get to go in. More recently, I have to admit that it seems inordinately cruel. The words that God spoke to Moses as he looked to where he had been, I will let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over, seem like the coldest, most withholding words that could ever be uttered to somebody who had been so faithful. And God's instruction for him to ascend to the top of Mount Nebo to look at the land before dying seems a little bit like rubbing Moses' nose in it. I'll stop there. That does honestly capture a little bit of how I feel when I read this story. It's interesting. He comes to the end of this journey. And that's my first approach. But through Ruth Haley Barton's work and through some of my own work, I've been thinking about it. And honestly, friends, I don't think it's a punishment. I think we read it that way, and I understand why it hits us that way, but I don't think that's what this is about, and I don't think it's actually cruel. I don't think it's a reaction to anything that Moses has done wrong. Actually, I don't even think Moses is upset about it. You almost get the sense that perhaps Moses is overjoyed to even have laid his eyes on that promised land. Let me tell you why I don't think he's upset about it. Moses will argue with God all the time in the scriptures. Moses, the scriptures say, knew God face to face, like nobody else has, had conversations with God as a friend knows a friend. Moses objects to God. Moses gets God to change God's mind. Let me give you an example. One of my very favorite stories in all the scripture, Exodus 33 and 34, God has said, you know what? These people are insufferable. These Israelites that are brought out of slavery, they're a stiff-necked, frustrating people. They're unfaithful. They're idolatrous. They whine and they complain. And so listen, they're still my people. They're still going to go into the land that I've promised, but I'm not going to go with you because my presence would consume them. And Moses says, wait a minute, God, wait a minute. You are what make me unique, your presence. And you are what make this people unique. Your presence is everything. So here's the deal. If your presence is going to go, don't tell us to stay. And if your presence is going to stay, don't tell us to go. Wherever you are, God, that's where we want to be. Because what matters more than anything is your presence with us. And God says, okay, I will do as you say. I will go with the people. I will continue with you. God changes God's mind. Moses is practiced in the art of arguing with God. And it may not have worked out at that call. He tried several times, right? He said, no, 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 at the burning bush. Please just send somebody else. But it seems he got better at that skill over time because God changes God's mind elsewhere. All that to say, I think Moses knows the art of this. And I think the reason that the scripture doesn't record Moses arguing with God about this matter is because Moses didn't have any argument. I don't think he had any objection. So why is this? Why would Moses not object in that moment? Perhaps because he knew what he wanted more than anything, more than the promised land, was that he wanted to be with God. And he wanted his people to be on God's path. Perhaps it was because he knew that there was something good coming in the future. Perhaps it was because he knew there was somebody good coming behind him who could lead. Perhaps it was because he'd learned to trust that God's faithfulness and God's surprising grace in the past was the best indication of the promise of God's blessing and God's provision in the future. And he had just learned to rest in that trust and find that to be enough. Perhaps it was because of the very thing that he begged for in Exodus 33 and 34, and that was God's presence. And maybe that was the clarifying moment that he realized that's what he wanted more than anything. And so if this was to be the end of the journey, so be it. I can't help to sort of fast forward a couple centuries. I cannot help but think about Martin Luther King every time I read this text and the way that he uses this text. In the final hours of his life, the night before he would be assassinated, he gave a speech in Memphis called "I've Been to the Mountaintop," April 3rd, 1968, in which he talks about this text. He talks about his own Moses experience, and this is what he says, literally, hours before he will die. This is how he closes his speech. "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter to me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And God's allowed me to go to the mountaintop, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people, we will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight, and I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. For mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And I think about the witness of these two theological giants spread throughout history. And Moses' experience and Martin Luther King Jr.'s interpretation of that experience. And I wonder, what does that mean for us as a people of faith? Go back to that first image that you had of common grace. Go back to that image of where you thought common grace would be today. What's the same? What's different? What's changed? What's better? What's just different? What's worse? Now that we've lived into that reality, maybe there's a sting for you in whatever the difference between the expectation and the reality is. And the difference of how you thought things would go and how things are actually going. Where you thought we were heading and where we are now. And if there is, that's okay. Maybe there's a sting because I'm leaving. Because we've prayed and we've connected and we've cried and we've served and we've laughed and we've walked through the journey of loved ones dying. We've rejoiced in birth and baptism. We've grown together so much, and leaving stings sometimes. And if that's you, that's okay. But maybe the takeaway is that life in community, together in joy and adversity, in knowing and unknowing, in clarity and wondering, that going together with God through God's vision into the future, that is in and of itself the very gift of God that we seek after. Perhaps the message, the lesson in Moses' life and Moses' death is that is the gift of God, going with God. And maybe it was less about the promised land, less about the destination than we imagined. When I was in New Zealand with Hope, we were on our honeymoon, and we had been planning it for a long time. I'd been planning for a long time, and I was talking to the travel agent. We were moving from Christchurch to go to another place. And she had booked a hotel, and I said, no, I don't want to go that way. I want to go the other way around Mount Cook, the other way around the mountain. And she said, why would you do that? It takes twice as long. Instead of 4 hours, you're going to have like an 8-hour drive. And I said, because Arthur's Pass is between there. Arthur's Pass is potentially one of the most beautiful drives that exists in the entire world. And you drive through this snaking valley, and on either side, straight up, are these mountains. In many places, you feel like you're dozens or hundreds of feet off the ground on a bridge that's being suspended by the mountain itself. And it is absolutely gorgeous. And I told our agent, I said, it's not about getting to the location. It's about what we're doing along the way. And I wonder if that's part of the message, is that it's not about the finality of where God is taking us. It's about how we experience God in the midst of it. Friends, the promise, the joy, the salvation, it isn't someplace else. It isn't around the next bend. It isn't in the next milestone of worship attendance. It isn't at the next great event. It isn't when you get your life together, when you figure things out. It isn't somewhere down the road. It isn't when things calm down. It isn't when you fix this or that. The promise, the joy, the salvation, it isn't about some destination out there. It is a reality that is right here and now. It's already being offered to us. I would love to go with you into the next steps of faithfulness that God calls this community to. I really would. But more than that, even more than that desire, I glory in the glimpse of what God is doing with and in and through you. And I revel at the terrain that we've covered and how much we've seen. And I delight in the memories and the indelible impact that you all are sending me away with. And I am giddy for the future that you all will make happen here at Common Grace and for the future that I will move into in my ministry. And I am content, knowing that together we have experienced the gift of God, and apart we will do the same. And in all things, there is nothing more that I want to do than experience that goodness and that blessing and that joy, and to point other people to that life that is truly life. So above all this day, I am thankful. And much to my own surprise, I am finding that to be enough. So may it be for each of us. Amen.